So I'll start with a comment by Sir William Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws of England in 1765. Blackstone writes, "When money is lent on a contract to receive, there is an increase by way of compensation for the use, which is generally called interest by those who think it lawful, and usury by those who do not." The history of the denunciation of interest is as old as interest itself, going back some 5 millennia. We find it in the biblical injunctions against charging interest, at least against Jews charging interest to fellow Jews. We find it in the ancient Hebrew word for interest, neshek, which is a serpent's bite. We find it in the Athenian lawgiver Solon's destruction of the mortgage tablets in the 6th century BC Athens, and in the denunciation of lending at interest by Aristotle, who writes that money was intended to be used in exchange, not to increase at interest. And Aristotle's views then found their ways into the opinions of the early church fathers on lending at usury, into the scholastics of the medieval period, notably Thomas Aquinas. And although things start to change in the 16th century, Luther himself was a great critic of lending of interest, rather old-fashioned in that way. And my favorite denunciation of interest comes from an Elizabethan diplomat and judge called Thomas Wilson, who wrote a discourse upon usury in 1572, where he likens the usurer to hell insatiable, the sea raging, a cur dog, a blind mole, a venomous spider, and a bottomless sack, whereby you may be assured that the devil dwelleth, whereby the devil dwelleth within. Now, this denunciation of interest continues into the modern age with the socialists and anarchists of the 19th century, the communists into the 20th century. In 1966, the Red Guards set up a committee within the People's Bank of China which was intended to destroy the last vestiges of capitalism by forbidding the lending at interest within the banking system. We find it to a lesser extent, I think, in modern policy making, which draws largely on the economics of John Maynard Keynes, who himself was constantly criticizing the high interest rates of the 1920s and 1930s, which he blamed for the Great Depression. And then go forward into the last decade. We have the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby's War on Wonga, which was a benighted payday lender that Welby thought was charging too high rates of interest. The market discovered it was charging too low rates of interest relative to its rates of default. And Wonga went out of business without any help of the good Archbishop. And just after that, we have then President Erdogan of Turkey decrying the high interest rates that Turkey was forced to pay after its banks and corporations racked up a huge amount of debt. And Erdogan decried what he called the interest rate lobby, a mysterious cabal operating around the world, pushing up Turkish interest rates. Whereas I argue if there ever was an interest rate lobby, it's always been an interest rate lobby pushing for lower and lower interest rates. And Erdogan himself is its chief exemplar. So why has interest persisted for so long? Well, I think and as I say, we have 5 millennia of record of interest, and we know that interest existed in prehistorical times because we find it in the etymologies of the word for interest in the ancient languages that invariably refer to the productivity of animals, of livestock. So we can surmise that interest was being charged on agricultural loans in prehistoric societies. So why did interest exist? Well, it existed, and I think this point is best made by another economic historian, Bill Gertzman of Yale University, who says that the invention of interest is the most important invention in the history of finance because it allows people to transact across time. Every economic and financial transaction takes place across time. Those transactions must be coordinated. Money in itself doesn't do the coordination. The act of coordination of borrowing and lending across time is performed by interest. Interest exists within human nature because of our mortality, because of our impatience, because of our preference for the present over the future. The present, not just because of our impatience, but because the present is more secure than the uncertain future. So Thomas Wilson, who I mentioned earlier in decrying interest, refers to the interest being the price of time and the usurer being the seller of time. Now, Wilson, who is backward-looking, in other words, backward-looking to the medieval scholastics, even though he's a Protestant, believes that time, in effect, belongs to God, but the modern view, which one can find in the Renaissance, one can find it even in the writings of Seneca, is that time is man's most precious possession. I don't have time to talk to you about all the functions of interest, but we find it in the modern world through an inducement to lend. Without interest, there would be an encouragement of hoarding. We find it in the valuation of assets, the existence of real estate markets in Mesopotamia and other countries. Without an interest charge, you cannot have a real estate market because you cannot value a long-dated asset that gives off a stream of income. Without discounting it, you would then have each property in principle worth an infinite amount of money. And what I chart in the book I recently written is that most of the great speculative manias have occurred at times of ultra-low rates. And Kwasi Kwarteng will talk to you later about John Law, but what's interesting to my mind about John Law is when he comes to France and sets up his central bank in the early 18th century, he does it with the intent of replacing the gold money with the paper money and using the paper money to reduce the rate of interest, and creates the great speculative bubble known to us as the Mississippi bubble, followed by a burst of inflation and the collapse of his system. Anyhow, more for Kwasi to talk to you about later. Interest is a spur to efficiency. In the Middle Ages, the ports charged David Abernathy will correct me if I'm wrong, a demurrage charge for ships dawdling in port, and in that sense, the interest is like a demurrage charge. If you demur on producing your goods, you will be charged more. So it's a spur to efficiency. It's also a measurement of risk, what the 18th century philosopher Ferdinand Galiani referred to interest as the price of anxiety. All loans involve some anxiety, and there has to be a price on it. And we find that in the ancient world, in that seafaring trips, loans on seafaring trips were charged at a higher rate, and in the bottomry loans of the Middle Ages, likewise loans which contained, if you will, the interest rates contains a form of insurance against loss. We find interest affecting the distribution of income and wealth. The main body of writing on interest that I mentioned right at the beginning has been to see interest as extortionate, and in particular the compounding of interest being impossibly unfair. And this is not to be lightly dismissed. In the ancient world, people could, as in the modern world, people could enter into debt, bondage, and slavery through the compounding of interest. However, in a modern society, or even not even that modern, but in a society in which capital is productive, it seems that the lender, the owner of capital, should get a return on their loans. And to my mind, what has happened, and people have failed to observe in this era of ultra-low interest rates that we've been coming out of, is that the main beneficiaries of the ultra-low rates were those actually who possessed capital, who actually or had access to very cheap loans, which they could then use to whether to buy houses or to buy up companies or to buy shares. And so that interest will always affect the distribution of income and wealth in a static society. That can lead to the debt crisis that were common in the ancient world and thereafter. But in a dynamic world, interest is necessary because the very term capitalism, actually a piece of capital requires some income to be discounted. Capitalism without interest is impossible. So my final thoughts are that if you look, interest has been sort of neglected by the modern economists. It's become, interest is viewed merely as a policy tool for controlling inflation. But if you look at and there's no intellectual interest, well, there's been very little intellectual interest in the subject itself. But if you look at the writings of earlier economists on the subject, you see how important it is. Irving Fisher, the great American economist, wrote that interest was an omnipresent phenomenon. Joseph Schumpeter wrote that interest enters into every calculation. More recently, Jeremy Stein, who was briefly a Fed governor and who teaches at Harvard, wrote that interest or monetary policy gets into all the cracks. And funny enough, Karl Marx himself said something similar, where he wrote that interest lives in the pores of production like the gods of Epicurus between the clouds. Interest has always existed. It is a necessary aspect of economic activity. When interest is mispriced, then bad things happen. To some extent, one can ascribe the failure of the Soviet Union to the mispricing of capital and the absence of an effective rate of interest in the allocation of capital, and likewise that of China during the Maoist period. So, and then I would go and think of the last decade after the global financial crisis, this unparalleled period of negative, and here and in other parts of Europe and in Japan, of zero, of negative rates, something that had never been seen before in the history of mankind. If interest is the price of time, the negative rate was actually turning the clock back, that puts you in an Alice in Wonderland world, which anyone who's been observing the financial markets of the last few years would have noticed. And my final thought was a comment which I hadn't included in my book, but that I read later by Edmund Burke, where he says that interest, the great guide of commerce, is not a blind one. It's very able to find its own way, and its necessities are its best laws. And perhaps contrary to Mario's thesis about money coming from the state, and that being, I'm not sure if he said it was a generally benign outcome, but I would say that the problem with the fiat currency, which we see in John Law's day and more recently, is that it makes the interest rate highly malleable to a group of central planners who don't have the information to set what is this universal price. And in time, I think, if we are to heal our societies and our civilizations, our economies, we have to find a way of having the market return to play the prime role in the setting of interest. Thank you.
Yes, please remain on stage. 10 years ago, or when I first heard about people speculating about that we were about to get negative interest rates, I must admit I had never heard of that before. Would you say, can it ever be justified?
Could a negative rate of interest?
Yes.
I mean, that's a moot point. If people have, you could imagine a society in which, a very aging society, in which wasn't productive, and in which people, wanted to store goods or capital for later consumption, and there was a great, and therefore you could they were prepared to suffer a loss of capital. I can see that being a special case. If you're adamant that interest comes from time preference, you will probably argue that time preference could never be negative, that the price of that the clock can't, or you shouldn't, be turning backwards. But having said that, one thing I should say is that there are about 20 different interest rate theories, which they're not mutually exclusive. But if you don't believe in time preference or impatience as a theory of interest, then in principle it could be negative.
One comes to think about Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity, time moving in curious ways.
Yeah.